Hello, welcome back once again to talk about the fabled city of Atlantis. I just want to again preface this whole idea because when you name drop the word Atlantis, a lot of minds shut off, and it's easy to understand why. It's kind of like saying that, hey, we found the secret entrance to heaven or hell or whatever. It seems like a fictitious type thing in a lot of people in the modern mind. But I have to remind anyone watching this that people thought the exact same thing about the city of Troy. The city of Troy was relegated as a fictional place for many years, that it was just the creation of Homer or the poets that he derived his story from. But it turned out that the poets were indeed somewhat correct. Maybe they embellished on certain aspects of the story, such as the young Paris, who in reality would have been like in his 40s or 50s at the time, according to, In Search of Troy with the host Michael, I forgot what his last name is, great show. But the idea was that the characters were based on real people, but the events likely didn't unfold the way that they did in the book. For example, in we take for the idea that a war was started over an unfaithful wife. Here's what the reality would have been, because this happened many times in different history. The Helen of Troy, Helen was actually the queen of Sparta, and by marriage, if Paris had married Helen, he would be the king of Sparta. That is, if you look at what the ramifications were of their union, that's what it is. And Agamemnon, basically trying to control the Greek states, would suddenly have a very big rival in one of the biggest partners within the Greek states, that of Sparta. And Sparta allying itself with Troy would have been a political disaster. So when you look at the idea of why they went to war, it wasn't just because of one woman. It was a woman that had a lot of power and her influence, and she left for a seasoned war veteran, not a young boy. You can kind of see where the bias comes in, right? If you're talking to a Greek audience, you play up the emotions of how unfaithful maybe the woman was, and what a young man, a young boy, not a warrior, Paris was, but indeed it was the exact opposite. He was fully capable of winning the respect of a woman of Sparta, which, if you know Spartan history, it's quite a big deal. Um, but with that said, Troy aside, Troy was discovered to be a real place, vindicating the poets, which had no real claim on making a false history. They were embellishing a real history for their audience. Um, so the idea is that Troy was a real place. Atlantis is likely in the same boat. Atlantis being a real place, especially when we talk about the Ricat structure. In my last video, I talked about the idea of a mega tsunami being generated by the volcanic collapse of one of the major volcano on the island of Fogo in Cape Verde, which is located just west of the Ricat structure. Let me bring that up. So here's Cape Verde, and here is the island of Fogo. Unlike last time, not mispronouncing the word. But anyway, this collapse, you can kind of see the remnants of it here today. This is the original volcano. Here's the modern volcano. These things are absolutely massive. So you can see with the Google meter there, that's 1,000 feet across. You can just get an idea of how big this is. This is almost about 3 miles, just for its crater alone. And so this whole entire flank collapsed in the ocean. And looking at some of the other studies, is generated, they estimate anywhere between 150 to 200 kilometers, cubic kilometers of rubble collapse into the ocean from this event. So we talk about the dating. I mentioned before that this study dated it to about 73,000 years ago, which is quite further back than 11,000 that Plato gives. And so I was looking at the dating to try to come to a determination of what the nuance may be between the two dates. And just looking at some of the logic that's been presented in the study is the idea of using exposure time, basically what they call uh, cosmogenic dating. So basically, the idea is you have um, radioactive rays from different rays from space, basically, that interact with the rock, and that rock will basically have a decomposition. In this case, they use the decomposition of helium to measure exposure time. And that exposure time was measured in these rocks about 73,000 years ago. The thing is about this method is that it kind of assumes that the exposure is based on the surfaces that are presented here. These are the rocks that they measured from. And they show that these come from this kind of cliff face here is the kind of the sediment level. And they were basically, the tsunami came in, pushed these rocks up and over, and they're basically laying on ground cover. There might be something to be said about how much ground cover there is here, because it's like whether or not this is 73,000 years worth of cover or buildup, or I don't know, someone with more geology experience may have to look into that question. But the one that I'm more concerned about is the exposure rate, because it's assuming that the rate of exposure happened while they're in these locations. But even from their own pictures, you can kind of see here this cliff face, and there's many rocks that are below the cliff face that come from the same sedimentary layer. So it's not to say that at one time there was likely here's the cliff faces here, that there was likely exposed cliff faces with these same boulders that were then pushed up with the tsunami that were already being exposed to the elements beforehand, and that they were not covered at the time of the volcanic caused mega tsunami. So what we're looking at, the 73,000 years ago, is an upper estimate of time. That it's not a minimal estimate of time. That is just about exposure time of these rocks. These rocks have been exposed to the elements for 73,000 years in total time. So whether or not that's to say that the tsunami happened exactly at that time would be a small leap to say where they were located beforehand, other than they were somewhere on the cliff face. Because that's what we have. They were somewhere of a cliff face. They were exposed for some number of time, some number of years, and then they were displaced and moved. So the idea is that that does give a lot of wiggle room for Plato's timing of the destruction of the city of Atlantis made by this activity to be completely plausible at 11,000 years ago, while these were probably being exposed to the elements years before that, before the collapse of the volcano, leading to a massive mega tsunami. So there's a little more images, supernova explosion occurs, sending out cosmic rays, hits rocks, rocks give half-life, just kind of basic idea of how they do that dating. Now we've come to another thing. I said before I mentioned the idea of maybe the sea level being higher. I'm kind of going to recant on that because I think there's a better explanation rather than the sea level being higher. I think the entire continent was lower. And I have a good reason for this, is that I know on Bright Insight, they talk about the idea of a localized plume that's under the Rakat. That definitely would account for some elevation rise in a localized area. But we're talking about an ancient sea that may have existed in this entire western part of the of Western Africa. With sparse islands, with the Cape Verde still being well above sea level, even if we take these numbers into account, all these islands would still be above sea level. Morocco being, this island with a cutoff into the Algiers and Libya, all this being kind of impassable by boat, you would still have to go through the Pillars of Hercules in order to get down here, with another sea, basically, that was down here, with a greater sea that surrounded it. So this is one of the things that none of the other locations for the proposed city of Atlantis can account for, is the idea of a sea being surrounded by a greater sea. So this missing sea is basically what we see here today. And the reason why it's no longer in the ocean is because simply the African or Nubian plate is supremely active. So just looking at this image here of like the predicted direction that the Nubian plate is currently going. I say Nubian because it's reading some of the literature on it. A lot of people prefer this terminology, Nubian. It's actually an old Egyptian term for people that came from more south in Africa that were living in Egypt. This Nubian plate or African plate is actually moving northeast at a kind of a fast rate. It's colliding currently with other plates and displacing them. What this also creates is the idea is that the ocean floor is heavily pushing on the African continental shelf. So when that happens, when you have ocean floor impacting a continental shelf, you have a thing called subduction, where the ocean floor is being pushed underneath the continent. Let me get a good picture of subduction here. Subduction zone. No, I don't know if this is kind of geology review for some, but just to kind of go over the idea of what this means is that basically you have a oceanic crust that is being pushed under the continent, and by a result would lift the continent out of the water basically a little bit per year. And so what we're seeing here is that the Nubian plate is very active, moving to the northeast. And because of that, the ocean crust is also being pushed in that direction too. Likely because of maybe a lot of volcanic activity that is in the area that is pushing all this pressure in that direction, thus creating a scenario where the whole western side of Africa is basically being pushed out of the water at a rate which to be determined, but over 11,000 years, I think it's pretty incredible that after a mega tsunami, the evidence of the previous ocean slowly going away as a plate rises out of the ocean over that long period of time. This activity is so active right now that on the eastern side of the plate, it's actually splitting right now as it impacts these other plates. So you have like these major divides in East Africa right now. East Africa plate activity? I don't know. There are some nice pictures where it shows like a real big split that's going on, especially when they talk about this kind of triangular area here. This is like super active as far as a lot of the activities go. But this is basically what it comes down to, is the idea that we can account for elevation difference of where the sea level should have risen to on the African plate. And it's not the ocean that's been moving, like I stated in my previous statements, but rather it's the African continent itself has been moving. And what they call a tectonic uplift, right? So you have this motion of the tectonic plate moving in a northeastern direction, lifting the continental shelf as ocean floor pushes it up as it subducts itself underneath the continent. If you also watch my previous video, one of my previous videos on the rarity of oil, you also have the idea that the subduction zones would also probably make these areas very oil rich. You can probably look at some of my past videos for that theory. But as far as travel to this area, Bright Insight did bring up the idea that there is a travel advisory to this area, and there's not a lot of industry, which doesn't bring a lot of companies there. But perhaps the pursuit of some natural resource like oil may spark renewed interest in the area. It just depends on whether or not people believe the theory I proposed about the natural process in which the earth creates oil at a much faster rate than previously stated. That could be an economic reason for returning to the area, and by creating an economic reason, we have now a justification to perhaps secure funding to be there for an excavation of the site. Because some of the major things that have been pointing out to me from some of the people that have posted here are just the idea of coming out here and getting sedimentary layer samples, because you have the idea if there's a huge shift in water that came to this area, we should see sedimentary layers. And getting core samples would help prove that, as well as treating this like an ancient disaster site. Like, we have FEMA go to a disaster site. They have an idea of where water is going to flow, where to look for people. They have a plan of action. Taking that kind of mentality and applying that to this, so that we have basically an area that's been subjected to a tsunami of massive scale, where would things end up? And in my mind, what we're seeing here is we do an excavation basically of the northeastern flank, which would be the southwestern flank likely took the brunt of this, which you can definitely see the erosion is much heavier um, on this side in particular. It's kind of hard to see elevation in this, but this is definitely higher over here. So basically, you're looking at these kind of areas of the ridges where things would be cupped in, where water would come in and kind of spill over, and things would be caught in like eddy currents as the water moved out over time. So basically, looking for there, I would actually also, because this site, because the idea of Egypt being a colony of Atlantis, I would also suspect that there is a subterranean structure of some kind that may still be intact, and that the inner circle as well as the inner ring would be the best chances for that, especially since the second ring was supposedly part of the religious order or the priesthood order that they had. I just have to bring it as if that's true, then there's a direct connection to an organization called the Priests of Ptah that was in Egypt. The Priests of Ptah, what's interesting about them is this is in Memphis. What's interesting about them is that they were not only a religious order, but they were also advisors to pharaohs. One of the most famous most famous priests of Ptah being that of Imhotep, which his name has been, thrown around Hollywood for years. The name of the mummy and stuff like that. And one of the reasons why they have this kind of weird thing in Hollywood for Imhotep is the fact that his body cannot be found. It's gone. But it's interesting by his story is that whenever you see him and the pharaoh at the time, Dozer always had Imhotep's name near his. He was highly regarded at Egypt at the time, having been seen as somewhat of a salvation-like figure because he helped prepare Egypt to get to 7-year droughts and famine, which starts to have parallels with the biblical story of Joseph in Egypt, which is very interesting. Not sure if there's a way to really prove that connection. If this famous advisor to the Pharaoh was the same advisor to Pharaoh in the Bible. Definitely some liberties were taken if that's a fact, because that would put the Hebrew people in Egypt for like over 1,000 years, which I think a lot of Bible scholars would want to reject because it messes with their timelines. But the idea is that if you look at some of the stories behind the priests of Ptah, is that they were not only this religious order and advisors, they were also craftsmen. They were carpenters. They were basically like a craftsman guild, essentially. And so with this idea, this craftsman guild of Egypt, that this tradition kind of carried on, I would expect to find somewhat of the same kind of things in the Rikat structure. Like if we see that they did a lot of subterranean work as far as like the foundations of the Great Pyramids, we should expect to find similar foundations. Like they would have, like, for this mega tsunami to have caused that much damage, to remove subterranean structures that were made of granite, it would be quite the feat. But the idea that they are able to find fresh water in this middle structure while the rest of the groundwater is salt water, seems to me that there is some sort of water table in here that has been undisturbed or is creating fresh water in the same manner that we find, what is it? There was that fresh water that was found in the Bosnian pyramid? Pyramid spell. Sorry about that. Gosh, I don't want to really mislead you down this rabbit trail. I should have looked at that before this video, but some of you, so maybe there's a picture of it right here, but this is what I'm talking about: is the Bosnian pyramid having this fresh water flow coming into the structure that I'm not sure if they know where it even comes from at this point, but part of my previous theories about the ancient technology was that they had some very clever and rudimentary ways of manipulating water in order to do a lot of their technology. And this may be part of it. I don't know. it's a hypothesis, right, at this point. I have some experiments I still want to do in order to prove some of these, but based on my hypothesis, if correct, we should see a subterranean structure at the Rakat still. And that could actually have things that are artifacts that may be intact. So that's it for now. Just wanted to focus it. So to recap, we talked about the idea that the Fogo time estimate is based on exposure time of rocks that were dislodged from a cliff face, and that they may have been exposed for a longer period of time before the Fogo Island eastern flank collapse, thus giving room for Plato's time estimate to be correct. We also have the idea of the sea level not to have been risen that much, but rather the Nubian or African plate may have been risen out of the sea based on subduction of the ocean floor into the continental Africa, as the entire Nubian plate is pushed northeastern in highly active precession that exists today. And then third, the idea that we need to find a way to get out there. We need to dig. This could be one of the most important World Heritage Sites. This could be one of the oldest World Heritage Sites where we have a civilization at a period of time where a lot of scientists thought we were just hunter-gatherers. Like, you know how important that is? The human genome is over 200,000 years old. Like if you look at the mitochondria DNA, the oldest, the mother of us all, 200,000 years ago. If it goes that far back with our current DNA, look at how far we've come in a short space of time, and we are missing the majority of our history. So that's what I'm at. I'm after technology. I'm after practical applications, and I think that there's something to be had and learned from people of the past that may have already come up with a branch of technology that differs from our own. And we just haven't recognized it because they just took a different path. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a great day.